Hello, this is Mind the Gap, and I'm your host, Tim Dunn.
Please mind the gap.
If you listened to the very first series of Mind the Gap, and if you didn't, go and download it now. They're just lovely. You'll have heard how every element of our transport network, from tannoy announcements to architecture, is the result of over 160 years of dedication by staff and Londoners alike. But if there's one thing that cannot stand still, it's the transport system. It's always evolving to better serve the city and its people. This year, there's a really exciting project to help customers now and in the future, and that's going to mean evolution in real life and on maps of the London Overground. Okay, big question. Should women be allowed to vote? Yeah, I did just say that. I said that out loud. And that question does sound pretty extraordinary coming out of my lips right now, saying out loud in 2024. But just over 100 years ago, I mean, really, that's just a few generations ago, the right to vote in UK elections wasn't something that was open to every citizen. And the question of women getting the vote was a really live issue, and perhaps not quite as straightforward as we might assume. Among the groups that fought for that right were the Suffragettes, and today I am going to learn a bit more about who they were, what they did, why they did it in that way, some of the links to modern London, and the passionate legacy they've inspired in all kinds of ways. But why on earth are you saying, Tim? Why on earth are you doing it on a TFL podcast? Well, because in permanent recognition of all that work, that fight, and what they stood for, the naming of the London Overground line that runs through North London from Gospel Oak to Barking Riverside has now been decided. It is now the Suffragette line. And coincidentally, I'm on the London Overground right now, on the route of the new Suffragette line, and that's been named to celebrate how the East End of London's working class movement fought for votes for women and paved the way for many more women's rights. Now, that term, suffragette, conjures up a whole lot of images for me anyway, but in particular, the word refers to members of something called the British Women's Social and Political Union. That was a women-only movement founded in 1903 by Emmeline Pankhurst, the leader of the women's suffrage movement, and probably the most famous suffragette of them all, whose daughter Sylvia is also a pivotal part of this generational story.
Barking Riverside. This train terminates here. All change, please.
Okay, time now to meet Emmeline's great-granddaughter and Sylvia's granddaughter, Helen. But Helen is not someone I wanted to talk to just because of her family connections and her famous last name. I wanted to talk to her because she is a world expert on women's rights in her own right. She's a distinguished scholar, a campaigner, a CBE, an activist and an author who wrote a book all about women's rights in the past and now. She is truly, on an international scale, a remarkable individual and quite possibly the very best person on the planet to discuss this whole subject with. And I'm meeting her here on the edge of the heartland of the Suffragettes at Barking Riverside Station on the edge of London's East End. Well, Helen, I'm going to come at this and I'm going to put my cards on the table. I am ignorant in the extreme when it comes to a lot of this. So please do bear with me. And if I get some of the terms wrong, please scold me and tell me off. And because your career is extraordinary and remarkable, but can you just explain to me a little bit first about your career and how it's come about and what drives you? Is it your passion that's always driven you?
It's so much part of my identity. And I think of two golden threads. One is being brought up in Ethiopia, and that was because Sylvia Pankhurst, my grandmother, went to campaign against the fascist invasion by Mussolini of Ethiopia, went to live there, so I was born there. So that being born in Ethiopia and then coming and going between Ethiopia and the UK, becoming interested in those differences, becoming interested in poverty, but much more than that. So that led me to interest in international issues, but also in development and international development and addressing that. And then at the same time, I have this surname, and people would ask me about that surname, and that led me to questioning issues around gender and power. And, I knew that I came from this family of amazing women that had changed the UK in terms of the rights for women to vote, and more broadly than that was also a global movement.
Yeah.
So I think feminism and international interest and interest in development are two golden threads that are part of who I am and very much linked to that history and my forebearers.
I can just feel the passion in you. Your enthusiasm and passion for what you do is something that comes across in the way you speak and the way you hold yourself. Let's just get some of the terms correct in our mind, because, again, I'm often ignorant about the terms around suffragette and perhaps suffragist, or even the term suffrage. Could you just explain to us perhaps what some of those key terms actually mean?
Yeah, suffrage is around the right to vote and nothing to do with suffering, although for the suffragettes, suffering was very much part of their campaign. Suffragist was the people who were campaigning for the votes. That was the term that was used. And then the Daily Mail coined the term suffragette as a way of dismissing this new party, the WSPU, formed in 1903 by the suffragettes, as a way of dismissing it and kind of minimalising it and making fun of their approach. So it was...
suffragette.
Yeah, little, yeah.
Oh,
the kind of French diminutive. Emmeline, who was a Francophile, actually quite liked the term, as did many others. So they then embraced it, and then they called themselves suffragettes.
Own it.
Own it, absolutely.
Own it. Always own it.
Yeah.
I didn't realise that. But let's just talk about actually where we are right now, because this is Barking Riverside, where we are right now. But this area has got importance for the family, hasn't it, and the movement?
Yes,
to some degree.
yes. So in terms of the campaigning, it started in Manchester, then London, where Parliament was, where the power was an obvious move. Sylvia had already moved to London with her artwork. She felt that the East End of London was incredibly important because that was where poorer women were living. And if you were thinking about the vote, those people who needed it the most were the poorest women, the most marginalised. And the East End of London was an area where there was a lot of that.
Was it around similar reasons for that, around how you have people perhaps who are campaigning very hard because they want to make change happen, really quite sort of in a militant way, because they feel not enough is being done by, I suppose, constitutional methods?
Yeah, the split between mother and daughter, between the main part of the suffragette movement and the East End, was firstly over tactics. So Sylvia felt that more democratic, more people engaging was important. Secondly, autocracy, dictatorship versus voice. That links to the first, but it's wider than that she felt that it was important that people discussed and made decisions.
Yeah.
Militancy, Sylvia was very worried about some of the extremes of militancy, such as the destruction of art. Sylvia was an artist. She hated the idea that there was a destruction of art. It just went against the grain. And then probably family dynamics, mother-daughter, kind of sibling stuff going on. I'm sure that played a role. Yeah. And then fundamentally also, Emmeline and her oldest daughter, Christabel, felt that if you open the door for some women getting the vote, remember at the time not all men had the vote either, that would be a first step, and then other women could get the vote afterwards. Sylvia felt passionately that it was working class people that should get the vote, so that should be the focus, hence the focus on the East End of London.
They were fighting in different ways to today's campaigners.
Yeah, and that's another difference, I suppose. Initially, it was constitutional before the suffragettes, so that was petitions and letters. And then 1903, the suffragettes, fed up with that lack of progress, then using that deeds not words logo, so demanding change, both in the way that people campaign, so demanding a much more active, out on the streets, disrupting meetings, and then there's a gradual increase in militancy because the government becomes much, much more constrictive. They try and do more, the government stomps on them, tries to stop them, they become more militant, etc. So there's that. But they were also lateral thinkers. There's a lot of fun that they brought into the movement, so that they would, dress up, pop up in all sorts of places, use the colours very effectively. Yeah. The first
use the colours?
Yeah. So purple, white and green, colours still very much associated with the movement, and I love the fact that this line is going to be green, one of the colours. It would have been better if it had the three colours, I'm just saying.
I'm not going to that one. We'll ask the team.
But yeah, they use those those colours incredibly powerfully. And just think about the fact that also you have a much less literate society, and all you need is the colours to make your statements. Very clever PR.
I have to say, you are wearing purple top today.
I'm always on brand.
On brand.
On brand.
But so the suffragettes then are of a time, and it's a movement that lasts a specific period of time. Does it have an end point then?
So I suppose it starts in 1903 and then it ends, in essence, with the war, in terms of the main Emmeline's part of the movement. The ELF, East London Federation of Suffragettes, Sylvia's outfit continued. They're against the war. Another difference of view is that the main movement stops the campaigning in order to support the war effort. Sylvia's a pacifist. She thinks the war is just going to affect the poorest people the most, who are going to be fodder for the war machine, and so she's very much against it. She continues to campaign. So that's another difference, is the difference to whether you continue with your cause come what may, or whether you stop for the sake of the country.
And I suppose after the First World War, things change anyway. A change of perception of women in society as well, more generally, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, some people ask the question about would women have got the vote had it not been for the war? And my answer to that would be, by 1914, most of Parliament was in favour of women getting the vote. It was just Asquith and Lloyd George that had been the obstacles and remained the obstacles in a way. So a few of the leaders of government were against it, but otherwise it would have changed.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So already majority by 1914?
Yeah. So my sense is that they would have got the vote earlier if it hadn't been for the war. And remember also, this is a global movement. There's similar things happening in other countries where women do start to get the vote earlier. I love the complexity of it, as you can tell probably.
Yes.
I love the fact that they also cut across party politics. So Emmeline and Christabel become more and more right-wing. Emmeline, in fact, stands for the Conservative Party. Sylvia is very much on the left, stays very much on the left. And I love the fact that, therefore, in many ways, the suffragette movement, this line, cuts across party politics. That is really powerful in terms of a lot of the campaigning I do about trying to push still for equal representation in Parliament, because as far as I'm concerned, we're not there yet. Yes, women can vote equally with men, but we still don't have a gender equal Parliament. So they had different approaches, but they had one goal, and that goal was that women should be equal citizens in law and in practice. And yes, I fundamentally agree with that. Different people will have navigated the issues about how much militancy to engage with, how much courage you have. I mean, how much you could stick some of the violence that they were exposed to. Sylvia was in prison and on hunger strike time and time and time again, and suffered massively, as did many of the suffragettes. A few died as a consequence, but many suffered from all sorts of intestinal and eating disorders following the brutal force-feeding of this so-called liberal state. So, would I have had the courage to do some of that? I really don't know. I think I probably would have tried to do what I could, but how much of that I could have done, who knows? I'm
fascinated. Just going back on this point, you said the violence. I mean, again, in my ignorance, I think of fleetingly think about the suffragette movement. I think of women chaining themselves to railings to make a point and going on a hunger strike. But actually, you're saying that there's violence involved, and real violence.
Absolutely.
And we're talking terrifying stuff.
Absolutely, on both sides.
Yeah.
So what happens is, as they are silenced, they refuse to be silenced. They are imprisoned. They go on hunger strike. They are force-fed. Then the government is scared of them dying in prison. So there's this cat and mouse act, which means that they're released as soon as they get weak, and then rearrested as soon as they start eating again. And then the ratcheting up of violence includes, on their side, breaking windows, arson, bombing. I mean, they resort to what men have resorted to from time immemorial when there is a grievance and a cause that they are espousing. And change in terms of our democracy has rarely come through constitutional ways. It's, if you look at the history of the world, it has come through the fight for whatever cause that was. The thing that's unusual is for women to do that. That is unheard of, for women to use violence in this way for a cause about their cause. And then the really important thing to highlight in all of this this is that the government was using violence, including sexual abuse, but not wanting them to die. So again, interesting. And then the women were using violence and not wanting anybody to die. So they have been called terrorists, but terrorists who never wanted anybody to die in the process. They were lawbreakers in order to be lawmakers, but that use of violence is contained within this idea of not wanting anybody to die. So it was about attacks of property, for example, and then a lot of lateral thinking to make their cause heard. The vote was the first step towards citizenship, towards counting, towards having a political voice, and therefore to be able to change laws. So at the time, women didn't have much rights around divorce, around their own children, economic inequalities around pay, around pension, around violence against women. I mean, so many factors which could say are still alive and relevant now, but they campaigned because they were able to once they became citizens and were able to be in Parliament and change laws. And you see changes in Parliament as a consequence. And yes, it was very much a global issue. You have parallel campaigns, you have links between the suffragettes in many different countries. And, I was involved in the film Suffragette, which came out, I think, about 10 years ago now. And at
Surely
the end,
not. No.
I think it probably is. At the end, you see the dates of when women got the vote in different countries. So it starts with, I think the first one they show is the UK, although the UK wasn't the first. But you see the other countries, and there was always a gasp when people saw that it was only in the 70s that women in Switzerland got the vote. And then the last state there was in 2015 with Saudi Arabia giving the women the vote. So this idea about the gender inequality being global remains an issue that's very much relevant today. Things have progressed, but there's still a lot to be done. We don't have 50% representation. We don't have policies, that are equally in tune with women's priorities. And we see that when we ask for voting interests. They are different, and policies don't yet reflect that. We're getting there. We're now at 41% in the UK, which is great. It is progress, but we need to get to 50%. We're not there yet. There's still pay gaps. There's still gender pension gaps. There's still massive divisions about which types of work men and women take, which then result in inequalities of wealth. And then let me stop at violence against women, because I think that is the most fundamental statement about inequality that remains today. Right around the world, there is still a curfew for every woman and girl about where she can be, when she can be. That is a global factor. And as long as that remains the case, as long as gender-based violence is still a concern for every single woman and girl as to where she can be, we're not there yet.
And are we going backwards, do you think, in some places?
No, I think it goes forwards and backwards. It evolves, it mutates. Some things get better, other things get worse. I think there is room for a lot of optimism, and it's back to the importance of the agency of individuals and collectives and families and workplaces and everybody else to make a difference and to push for change, because we will get there. We will get to a better world. It's just that it isn't a direct line in that direction. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done by everybody, and everybody taking responsibility, men, women and everybody else.
You mentioned that the film you were in. What did you think when they came to you and said, we're going to make this film? What did you think?
So I initially didn't realise that it was going to be quite as big a thing as it was. And quite sheepishly I said, could my daughter be involved as well? So we both have this cameo role, and she even has one word, which is hello. But it was eerie, actually, to go into this room that they'd recreated as the Suffragette office, because I think about it a lot. I'm asked a lot of questions, but suddenly to be in there, to be in a room that felt like it was of that time. And then my main recommendation was the one I mentioned around getting the dates of the different countries, because I felt that would universalise the story, and I thought that was important, so that anybody watching it at the end, with all the emotions that go through it as you're watching it, at the end you realise that this fight was fought in different ways in so many countries and continues to be an issue.
How did you first hear about the Suffragette line being so named? How did it come to you?
I think I saw it on the news. Yeah, I think it was on the news, and I remember just thinking, wow, brilliant. And then realising its connections, that it was a line that, I had lived in Gospel Oak. My son was in Up Holloway. So it was quite nice that it was a line that actually had some personal meaning as well. And then I really felt that connection with East London was important, because not many people know that. And there is an assumption by some people that the Suffragettes were rich women from up north or something like that.
Yeah,
or
because the
other parts
outfits
of
you see
London.
in, but yeah.
Yeah, but actually it was very much a cross-class issue, and there were many, many working-class Londoners that were involved. So it was really nice that this line holds true to that story and tells that story, which is much less told.
Well, and I'm going to ask this as well. What is your hope in terms of equality related to this line? Do you think this can play a part in that? Do you think the naming of that will do things? What's your hope?
Absolutely. I think the naming of a line like this is a way that you honour the past, that people become aware of it, that you talk about it, that everybody learns more about it. And I hope can actually travel with pride somehow. You know, there's not enough for women and girls to look at that is positive about their story, and for this to be able to be told and to be part of their lives on an ongoing way, I think is really powerful and really moving, actually. Maybe one thing that's really important is that you can only campaign if you can get together. You can only get together if you can move. And, you know, public transport, especially for poorer people, was incredibly important in getting people from A to B, and continues to be. So, you know, lines connect people, transport connects people. And for women to be able to have that liberty to move, which we cannot take for granted, there are places when they don't have that individual right to do so, is incredibly powerful. And, you know, this line didn't exist then, but had it, I can tell you for sure, on those days where there were marches and things like that, it would have been full of women dressed up as suffragettes with their sashes and their Deeds Not Words and Votes for Women campaign. So absolutely really important that it's not just anywhere, it's a line that connects people. And that's what a movement is about. It connects people with a cause.
What's humbling to me is how Helen is continuing the work of her ancestors, but she's making all her own choices. She's standing alone, and she may not agree with everything the suffragettes did, or even how they did it, but there's a respect there that goes right through the history. Their aim is basically still the same, isn't it? It's equal rights for men and women. That's a fight that, as Helen says, continues every day and is there for us all to make a change.
This is the train to Gospel Oak.
As you can probably tell, I'm back on the train now, and we've left the East End, heading up towards North London. The Suffragette line travelling 13 miles along this route. I'm heading right for the end of the line at Gospel Oak Station. Gospel Oak, this area, is unsurprisingly named after an oak tree. It actually once marked the boundary, apparently, between the parishes of Hampstead and St Pankhurst. There's been a station here since 1860 as well. But I'm not here to talk about that past, really. I want to talk about the here and now with something of a comedy guru, the wonderful Cally Beaton. She is an amazing stand-up, a writer and a regular on TV panel shows who's had a large successful career before turning her hand to comedy and performance. She has, unsurprisingly, got a lot to say about equality, feminism and women's rights, and I genuinely can't wait to hear what she thinks about the suffragette line too.
Gospel Oak. This train terminates here. All change, please.
Cally, I'm slightly sort of concerned sitting here because you are such an accomplished broadcaster, podcaster. You're an all-rounder, and you've had a career in advertising and across the media. And yet, here we are sitting here in Gospel Oak Station, and I am sort of interviewing you.
Yes, you are. Well, be afraid. Be very afraid.
I'm terrified.
I think it's quite apt, isn't it, if we're talking about suffragettes, that you, a man, should be sitting here in awe of a woman. So it's a good start.
I quite frequently am in awe of many different women in my life.
But don't be in awe. You'll see that I'm as much of a hot mess as anyone you'll ever meet. So feel relieved. It'll be fine.
I'm feeling a hot mess here in the baking sun of Gospel Oak. But We're here in Gospel Oak because I think this is, well, first of all, the end of the Suffragette line, but also it's not far from where you live. So are you a regular user of this railway?
I am a regular user, yes. So this is about a 10-minute walk from my house. It backs onto the beautiful Hampstead Heath. So I have a beloved dog, Jeff, who many people know me for Jeff. They say I came for Jeff and I stayed for you. So I very often come to this part of London. And yes, we've used this line when my children used to go. My children are half Dutch. They used to use it to get to Dutch school every Saturday. And I'm very familiar with Gospel Oak. And it is a place of huge affection for me. Yeah.
And it's not the most romantic station, I can imagine it, but it's got a charm all its own. I think it's fair to say it.
I find it a romantic station. I've snogged people near Gospel Oak Station. Most people have, because it backs onto the heath. So for many of us, it has very romantic associations.
Well, if we talk about suffragettes, well, something that runs throughout all this is gender equality. And it runs through everything I can see throughout your Instagram and through your scripts and your shows, your books, everything you do, and being a mentor to people as well. Has that long been a passion and a thing that you've been striving for?
I didn't really think about it, but I became the youngest and only female member of the ITV board when I was 32. And that was only because I was running a little production company, a TV production company that got acquired by ITV. So I didn't try to become a woman in a male boardroom. I found myself there. And it didn't occur to me until about 10 years later what a challenge that had been.
Really?
And at the time, I normalised this immense imposter syndrome. I hugely overcompensated by just looking at what the men around me were doing, working harder, doing everything better, and then still just about being rewarded as they were, although financially I belatedly found out I was not rewarded as they were. And I talk about this when I do speeches, and I do lots of work in terms of sort of hoping to help break through barriers for women in business. And I ended up a single parent at that time in my life. And I think that was directly connected because I was so desperately trying to keep my head above water with no sort of allies or support, really. So I didn't think about what I was doing at the time, but I have looked back and thought I very much hope if there's anything I can do to stop other women having to go through that I will do it. So it has become a passion without me ever intending for it to be so.
Well, it's fascinating because I've been in companies where we have perhaps a female CEO in technology. And it seems being a surprise back then. And yet so many people in tech world and broadcasting are male, and you see that they occupy the big positions. I mean, it's still a massive problem. Why haven't we seen that change in the media world, do you think, still, 20 years, 30 years on that you started?
Well, I'm sure you know this statistic, but until I think it was last year, there were more CEOs in this country called John than there were female CEOs.
I didn't know
I
that.
think that was up until maybe 18 months ago. And when I put something out on Instagram about that, I got numerous people saying, oh, yes, in Germany it's this name, and in Sweden it's this name, and there's an equivalent of that in many, many European countries. So when people say, have we still got work to do? First of all, we all need to change our name to John. So we still, when you think about, deeds, not words, and everything the suffragettes stood for, I would love to think this wasn't necessary to even be thinking about 100 plus years on, but sadly, I'd say it still is. You'll imagine that International Women's Day is a busy day of the year for me. I usually do many events that day, and indeed that week I'll do a lot. And this year, I was really interested that they were talking less about the glass ceiling and more about the broken rung, meaning that it's not that women can't get to the top. That's not the problem. The problem is, from entry level to becoming managers and directors, something's going wrong much earlier in their careers. So by the time you're looking to recruit CEOs and board members, there are far less women in the pool, but it's too late by then. So something is happening from entry level to what the opportunities are in those first few years that women never catch up. So it's incumbent upon everybody to pull together. It's not about punching down to men. No. We want everyone to come up to the same level. I have no wish for anything bad to happen to men. I would like some better things to happen for women. So I think, it is about male allyship, and it is about sort of linking arms in order to achieve things that may be helpful. And sorry to bang on about this, but the other thing that's so important, when I go into businesses, particularly sort of STEM businesses, yes, which are still male-dominated, there are often loads of senior women making decisions, but above them is almost always a man. So there are women running swathes of these companies and in charge of the whole thing, but there is something at the top that means they don't get the final say. So it's not that we don't have senior women, but quite often the final decision maker is still a man.
I never thought of it that way. I thought of it that way. Do you see that the suffragette line being something towards sort of representation, potentially, of women in STEM? Is that something you see a link there as well?
I guess it's having the conversation, isn't it? Anything that becomes part of people's daily lives, and where also you might have a family that might come on the suffragette line that have never been on it before. They might be visiting London.
Yeah.
And there might be a conversation about why is it called this line? What is this? What does it mean?
What's a suffragette? Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, so I think what the suffragette movement did is it gave individual women the right to think that they had a voice.
A lot of your content in your comedy, it talks about equality. It makes it quite, in a kind of almost awkward way sometimes, but in a fun way, and that kind of makes it quite a rich theme for comedy.
Yes, it writes itself. Most of what I talk about, even though my haters will say that never happened if it doesn't suit them, the gender pay gap doesn't exist. So I get people debating the facts. I put one out that went viral a couple of months ago, which was where I got to an event and I was checking the slides with the tech guy and everything was perfect. I sent the slides ahead, but I don't send the briefing packs ahead, so whoever else does it. And my name was Carrie, not Cally. And I said, it's great, but could you just change my name to Cally? And he said, no, it's definitely Carrie. And I said, well, no, it's me. And then he showed me an email from a speaker bureau or something saying, no, it's Carrie. And the key bit there was, I just think that possibly a female tech might have gone, oh, I'm sorry. She might have still shown me the email and it's not my fault, but she'd have done it. But what was really interesting was the comments and numerous men telling me I must have made a mistake. Why didn't I get it right in the information I sent through? So I literally was mansplained my name. So when things like that happen, they go viral because so many people had the same experience.
You talk about passion drives you forward, but actually, is it also perhaps anger? Surely it must be anger, the way that people are treated now.
I didn't think I was angry. I've always thought I'm a very not angry person. And I now realise that anger is an emotion that women have had stamped out of them for generations. We were brought up being told not to be angry. I think lots of women are angry and it's still not appreciated from us. So everything I post and everything I say is done with a roll of the eye and a tongue in the cheek. But yes, I do have anger. If a woman does a gig, a stand-up gig, and has a bad gig, there will be people who leave that gig saying, you see, women aren't funny. You have become the spokesperson for all female comedians. I don't suppose there's ever been a male comedian in the history of comedy who had a bad gig and the audience went out going, you see, men aren't funny. And while that's going on, and while people are saying female comedian, female dentist, female CEO, we have work to do. And yes, I think I'm probably not angry enough.
I agree. How come you came to comedy relatively late? Is it because you realised you could be angry and it was there and you could have an outlet for that passion? Where did that comedy come from?
Well, I always had to find my voice in male-dominated rooms. So when I first started doing shows like QI, which was still quite male-dominated, I've been doing QI for years, even though Sandy was hosting it, I was used to just getting my voice heard, not waiting to say the perfect thing, but saying something and making the edit, as in give them enough that you will be in the edit, in a boardroom, in a TV studio. What got me into comedy was the advice of a much older, incredible woman who was Joan Rivers. So Joan Rivers had seen me. We used to bring our talent down to Cannes or wherever we were doing trade fairs. Yes. By this time I was working for one of the big Hollywood studios. And as the business lead, I would be the one to host these huge trade events. And Joan Rivers did a few for us, and I would host them, and it would be drunken TV executives, and I would be trying to keep the room vaguely on its feet until the person they wanted to see came on.
That's terrifying in itself.
Yeah, terrifying in itself, which that kind of was stand-up, but I didn't know it was. And then she and I had dinner not long before she died, just the two of us. And she said, you should have a go at stand-up. I was 45 at the time, a single parent of 2 kids. One of my kids has special needs. And I said to her, it's too late. You know, that ship has sailed. You know, I've got these kids, I've got this big job. And she said, I'm 81. You know, you're in the thick of it. Why don't you? And Joan Rivers, despite what people may think of her with her cosmetic surgery and her crass, brass jokes, she was breaking through the glass ceilings of Hollywood in the 60s and 70s when no women were doing that. Yeah. It was because of women like Joan Rivers that I grew up knowing women could be funny. And it was as much the fact it was an icon, like Joan Rivers telling me that, as the fact that I suspect if any trailblazing older woman were to sit with a woman 40 years younger and say, listen, you've got it all to play for, take all the risks you want because you're in it now. Yeah. I suspect that would be quite galvanising. So I'm delighted it was Joan Rivers because it's a better dinner party story. But which 81-year-old amazing woman, of whom, by the way, I think all 81-year-old women are amazing because they've lived a life. Well, who wouldn't want that advice? So yeah, and that gave me the confidence. I now know I'm 55 now. I know 45 was very young. I now know that 55 is young. I'll look back at this in 10 years and go, oh my God, I was really young at 55. And crucially, women are asked to sort of fade gently into that good night in their midlife. And I have become more and more visible in midlife. And I'm not doing things perfectly. It's not a redemptive story, but it is my story.
It's a great story. And I've listened to a couple of episodes of Namaste Mother on the podcast.
Cally Beaton's podcast is what's most... Let's give that a shameless plug.
Let's give it a shameless plug as well. I'm happy to do that. I'm very happy to do that. But
there is a book with the same title. So the book is going to be called Namaste Mother. Sorry if I've just ruined the tone of your whole erudite podcast.
I was so pleased you said that, not me.
There you go. So my book has that title, and it's a spin out of the podcast, but it is also it is a story of, we're calling it a modern manifesto for keeping cool, even when you're a hot mess, which is a nod to the messiness of life, but also the messiness of being a midlife menopausal woman. But actually, it's all about us reclaiming our power to tell our own story and daring to do the things that we want to do in life, regardless of what the world is telling us, which I think is maybe I should give a little dedication to the suffragettes. It's very suffragette-esque in its spirit.
What are your thoughts then about the suffragette line? Is it a good thing to call it that? And what do you think will happen as a result of that?
I think it's brilliant. I was so pleased when I was asked to come on because I thought it's my hood. This is where I live, and it's amazing. And I just think people now, it's like, why are you still talking about equality? Why are you still banging on about this? We'd love not to have to bang on about this. We'd love it to be a given. But while the things that the suffragettes were suffering, fighting for, doing, I think they would probably be shocked and appalled to see that any of these things are still having to be discussed. The CEO stuff, the gender pay gap, some of the violence against women and girls. So until we raise women and girls up to have all the same equality, safety and privilege that men have, there's absolutely a need for us to be talking about suffragettes. And what an honour to be near something that celebrates that in such a visible way. So no, I'm thrilled about it.
God, how do I, a man, follow those two extraordinary women in considering the name of the suffragette line? Well, actually, it's probably to agree with what both Cally and Helen have said. The naming of the suffragette line is really far more than that group from over 100 years ago. This isn't referencing just a single, isolated historical group or an event. It recognises the spirit instead of a whole movement more generally that continues to this day, in part, of course, inspired by those East End women who refuse to give up and refuse to compromise their principles. And the right to vote is one of those absolutely basic rights that we all take for granted in Britain now, don't we, I think? And we're lucky that we do take it for granted. But what I've been reminded by Helen and Cally is that we can't take that stuff for granted. We have to keep talking and keep moving forward because there's still so far to go. And so I hope that's what people think about when they see on those signs and the maps and the apps everywhere across the network the word suffragette. Thanks for listening to Mind the Gap. I've been your host, Tim Dunn, and this is a podcast created by 1860 for TFL. The producers were Verity Takala and Clarissa Maycock. The executive producer for 1860 is Gareth Evans, and the mix is by Rowan Bishop. The executive producer for TFL is Adrian Hyatt.